Okay, so questions about chords keep coming up on Reddit, and I've been putting off making a video covering this topic. I've been meaning to, and I just keep throwing bullet points into a Word document, and it's growing kind of unwieldy. And I've decided to just bite the bullet and attempt to do it. Um, I'm going to try to cover the topic somewhat comprehensively for both people coming from a classical background and people who want to use it more for pop, contemporary jazz type stuff. Um, but pretty much everybody needs to start in the same place, and that is with diatonic chords. Okay, so first off, you just want to start work on your diatonic chords with. It's going to be a technical feat at first if you're not comfortable with this. Um, and if you want to get really technically proficient, you can try to do it with both hands. Now, in the key of C, this is going to be very easy as you walk up your diatonic triads. Because it's all white keys, and so you just hold this shape and move it up the keyboard, and it's easy to do that with both hands. Doing it with both hands is not necessary. Eventually we're going to learn it in other keys, and it's going to be harder to play in other keys with both hands. That's a technical concern. We're more worried about a mental issue here, so don't let your left hand being involved be an impediment to you working on this. Work on this with just your comfortable right hand if you need to for quite some time, and get the mental aspect of it taken care of before you start worrying about the technical aspect over here, or set aside some separate practice time to work on that. Now, as for the mental part of this, while, like I said, you can play it in C pretty easily, technically. But you need to actually slow down and think about what you're playing. So I would recommend speaking the chord names. I would do both the chord symbols in standard pop notation, and also Roman numerals. Both are useful. So C major, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, B diminished, C major. And then obviously walk your way back down. Another thing to note is that you don't necessarily have to say C major, because with pop chords, if it's a C, that implies C major. If you don't say it's minor, then it's major. So C, B diminished, A minor, G, F, E minor, D minor, C major. So also try to do that with Roman numerals and specify, what's going on. Major 1, minor 2, minor 3, major 4, major 5, or you could say dominant 5. You should be aware of both of those, that your 5 is dominant. You're not playing it dominant. That would be dominant, and you could play it that way. But just be aware, dominant, minor 6, diminished 7, major 1. So do that, and then move on to other keys. And like I said, move on to the other keys and don't worry as much about the technical element as you're worried about the actual mental element of it. It's probably still going to be challenging for some of you technically, just in your right hand. So you can go around the circle of fifths, circle of fourths. You can go chromatically. You can go. There are several other methods for moving around that are useful, that I might talk about later. But mostly you just want to make sure you cover every key. So go up to F, and F major, G minor, A minor, B flat major, C major, D minor, etc., and back down, and then move to other keys. So get all your keys covered, root position. So you might get pretty good at being able to do that in root position, because the name of the chord is always, whatever is, if you're doing it with your right hand, it's usually going to be what's in your thumb. And that's pretty easy. But start doing it in inversions, and you really have to start thinking differently. For one, you have to be way more aware of where your hand is. Like I said in C, it's going to be a joke, because you start with your inversion, you just play all the white keys, but you start doing that in F, and you start thinking, oh, wow, okay. And that's kind of weird. And you go through other keys, you'll find that you have to very quickly be aware of everything that is sharp or flat in that key, and it will really make you think about chords very differently if you force yourself to work on this. You will have to think about chords as they're built from the third, because you're thinking from the third, and then you've got to build the chord around that, and you get used to internalizing that shape and associating it with that chord. And so, do the same thing. Talk your way through those chords, doing this in first inversion and C. And then second inversion, same thing, And once again, you're holding this weird position, and I guess you could look at the keyboard. It could help you. You could look and say, okay, this is C major, and you're looking at this key in the middle to think about what that chord is. C major, D minor, E minor, F major, and so on. But just forcing yourself to do this will really make you think about those chords very differently, and it'll give you a lot more fluency. It'll also be useful for, doing that, you're going to get very comfortable with sixths. So if you took the if you took the middle note out of any of those, you can get these running sixths. Not with the best fingering ever, but you can do that, and you can very quickly do fills. That's great in pop music. Just doing things in the sixths sounds great. So this will help you technically as well. Okay, so before I go any further and get into things that might not apply to as many people, I'm going to recommend writing these out.
Ain't nobody got time for that.
Now, the most important reason you want to write these out is so that at some point when you're no longer staring at your hands and you're not having trouble physically managing the keys, you need to be associating what you're playing with something on a page. That will really help your reading. If you're coming from a classical background, that's really going to help you make the associations between what's in your hand and what's on the page, so that you can quickly size up chords on a page and just reduce them into your head very quickly. So especially if you're classical, if that's your bent, I'd recommend actually writing that as sheet music on some manuscript paper. If you are more on the pop side and that's all you want to worry about, you could just write out a simple lead sheet. Just write out simple lead sheet notation, just slash notation with the chords over the top, and you play the chord changes for your diatonic chords. Which might also involve, if you're doing inversions, you might actually write it out as things like C over E, D minor over F, that kind of thing, so that you're making that association. Not that what you're doing up here necessarily is the same as having that kind of notation, but it does at least build it into your head a little bit better and make you think about singing those odd chords like that, especially if you do decide to add your left hand over here. Now, one thing that you could do for this is you could just throw this into Finale for especially the classical people doing the sheet music. You could throw it into Finale or some other notation program all in one key and then transpose it to the other keys. That's an option because the most important thing is that you're looking at a page and making the association with what you're playing. But if you're a person who is specifically struggling to look at the page and think about what a chord is very quickly by looking at it, I would actually recommend doing it longhand in every single key. There's just something about actually doing that and making yourself put a pencil to paper that internalizes it in a very unique way. So go for that if you really want to go the extra mile. Okay, so as I was editing, I noticed I used some pretty strong language there about the importance of associating things with stuff on the page, and I can already tell there are going to be some people who are going to yell at me about that. Because in the long term, it would be really good, especially for pop people, to associate it not with the page. But especially if you're a classical player, you want to be able to do that for your reading skills. Eventually, you want to internalize it. But even for pop people, where you definitely want to be able to associate it with your ear and things like that, and have it internalized and not be tied to a page, being able to look at a chord chart and very quickly comp that on sight. Sight comping that stuff is very important. Yes, the next step beyond this is getting to the point where you don't need anything in front of you. But I don't think that you should skip this step of being able to make that association, because from personal experience, I can say that will give you a lot of weakness in areas like reading, which is something I don't think that you should neglect. Okay, so while we're still talking about classical guys, you definitely should be able to play your cadences. This kind of thing. I'm sure you've seen this in books. If you're a classical player, you're already familiar with this stuff. So be able to do this in every inversion, in every key. That is pretty much the prerequisite for the next step. Okay, so this next step is kind of a bridge between classical players and bordering on getting into kind of the pop contemporary stuff. But I know that this is a skill that a lot of classical players wish they had, and there's no reason you can't do this. If you've got all those diatonic chords under your fingers and in your brain, and then you've got all the cadences under your fingers, you should be able to do this next bit pretty easily, and you might surprise yourself with how much you're able to play by ear or play very simple accompaniments for people, even without sheet music, even if that freaks you out. So pick a simple chord progression, like 1, 6, 4, 5, a little simple doo-wop progression. And I'm playing this in C. Now I'm trying to keep nice smooth voice leading. You should be able to move up and down the keyboard pretty effortlessly while doing this, while still keeping smooth voice leading. So I'll start going up a little bit. So I'm kind of moving up higher. I can start moving back down. Okay. Obviously, learn some other progressions. 1, 5, 6, 4 is a really popular pop one. I think that is the 4-chord song type thing. Also, if you want to get some diminished chords involved, this is a thing that shows up in some kinds of music. You do this little thing where you walk up from 1, make this little diminished chord here, and then walk to 2, and then on to 5. So it's kind of a 1, diminished flat 2, depending on how you want to think about it, or diminished sharp 1, and then 2, 5. And obviously, you want to take these and move them through every key. And just be able to efficiently do that. And if you can do it, then now you can comp in pretty much every key. And also, you'll just be better off technically. Okay, so next up, this might not appeal to some of the classical people, but definitely if you're doing any kind of pop music, your next step is to move from triads to 7th chords. This is definitely something that you want to be able to do technically in both hands. If you're a pop musician, if you're comping and you're in a group with a bass player, it's very likely that you need to be as proficient playing these chord shapes with your left hand as your right hand, because the bass player will be down here. You'll be comping a lot with your left hand and doing fills with your right hand. And if you're just comping behind like a singer, you'll be playing bass here and playing the chords here. But either way, you need to be able to play the chords in both hands. But obviously, like I said before, don't let that be an impediment to working on the mental task first. So you just need to cover all of your chord types. So you might start, you'll get most of them by just playing, once again, diatonically. So in C, that's pretty easy. Once again, you just make that shape and walk it up, and then you talk yourself through it. C major 7, D minor 7, E minor 7, F major 7, G dominant 7, A minor 7, B minor 7, flat 5. Or I guess classical people would call that half diminished. You're going to see it as minor 7, flat 5 on a lead sheet. You'll rarely see it as half diminished. Be able to do that, C major 7, then walk your way back down. And be able to do that in every key. So that gets a little bit challenging, and it is kind of a special thing. And then obviously work on the inversions. This gets really, really dense. This is very dense work. to be able to do this and then be able to walk it through all the inversions, especially in all these keys. It's crazy work, but it's very good. It's very good for your hands. So I'd highly recommend doing that. This is not something you're going to do overnight. This is something that you're going to chip away at for 10 minutes a day for months at a time. Okay. So a lot of you are probably aware that there are seventh chords that are not represented diatonically. Most importantly is your fully diminished seventh chord, or as non-classical people would say, just the diminished seventh chord. I wouldn't worry about working on this in keys. And there are some other chords, basically altered chords. Something that's altered in any way, not altered chords, but keys that have alterations, chords that have alterations. Like a dominant 7 with a sharp 5, that kind of thing. I'll talk about that more in a second. I wouldn't worry about that so much right off the bat. So your diminished chord, don't worry so much about doing it diatonically and putting it in a key. Just work on being able to play the inversions of your diminished seventh chords. And you probably know there are only actually 3 of these, because by the time you wrap around, by the time you're here to the E flat, E flat is just an inversion of the C. The C, and then the F sharp is also an inversion of that, and A is an inversion of that. So C, E flat, F sharp, and A are all the exact same chord. So those are pretty easy to work through. Just make sure you can physically execute those. It's less of a mental task, and we'll worry about putting them in context, maybe in chord progressions. The other one is just physically, maybe things like I said, like a dominant 7 sharp 5. I don't know how much you really need to work on these in isolation, because once you're really good at your diatonic chords and thinking of chords in the context of keys, you'll get to a chord like that and you'll just make that alteration. You'll know to do that because you know how to spell the chord. The chord itself is just one block of information in your head. You very quickly do it, and you just barely have to think about raising that 5. Your hand is already there, and it's not a huge jump. So I don't know that you should invest a lot of time, doing something like trying to play in both hands, that kind of thing. It's not the way you are going to use those alterations in context. But definitely work on your diminished seventh chords. Okay, so next up, we're going to talk about upper structures and polychords. You really need to know everything up to this point pretty well to be able to work on this. This gets complicated. I'm not super fluent here. This is where the rubber really meets the road, and it's very practical. So you need to know how to break up chords and how to build chords with parts of other chords, basically. So probably the easiest example, if you want a C major 7 chord, you can play C in the bass, and you can play an E minor triad on top of that, and that makes you a C major 7 chord. And you should be able to build a major 7 chord, any major 7 chord, this way very quickly. So basically the process is you need to think, okay, if I need a C major 7 chord, I need to play E minor. If I need an F major 7, I need to play A minor. If I want to play B flat, D flat, E flat, G flat. That should be a 1-2 very quickly. You should be able to jump around the entire circle of 4ths and 5ths and do that kind of thing and be able to play all of those. And then, if you really want to take it up a step, and I'm so bad at this, I feel bad about this, do it in inversions. So now you've got this multi-step process where you're going, okay, C major, E minor, but it's in this inversion. And then same thing, walking around here, you keep going. Being able to do it in inversions will really put you in a much better place to just not be stuck in that thing. It's the same problem that so many people have where they want to play a chord progression, and instead of playing, smoothly, from, they end up playing this real blocky. it's that same problem, but just in a jazzier context. Yes, you can hide it better, but if you really want to have better voice leading, you need to not have the mental block that when I'm saying C major 7, I can't immediately think E minor in any inversion. So work your way through that. And honestly, if you're at this point in terms of your theory and you're working on this, you probably know how to build all of your others. And you can start to extrapolate that. If you wanted to build a C minor 7 chord, to put an E flat major on top of that. And then you can work that around all of your chords. And then obviously bigger chords, if I went back to the C major 7, if I just make the chord not an E minor triad, but I made it an E minor 7th chord, now I've got an I have a C major 9 chord. So I've basically upgraded that. And that's something you're going to do all the time if you're reading off of jazz charts, if you're just like comping off of charts very quickly. So keep doing that. Make sure that you can build all of these little chord on top of bass type situations. And then obviously you can move into other things, kind of the more polychordal things where you might play like C major 7 down here with a D major on top. You get, C major 13, sharp 11, that kind of thing. You can probably go look around and find some polychord charts and some other upper structure type charts online, and just work on all of those. Just be aware that you need to work on them and start working on them. This is definitely a lot of work, but it'll make you much better. So on the topic of that last little bit with the upper structure and the polychord type stuff, that stuff is amazing if you also play things like guitar or accordion. It can really help with guitar if you're playing in certain settings to be able to know that if there's a certain 7th chord, and maybe it's hard to get to that shape, but you could play a triad, some bar chord, or just for efficiency of motion or good voice leading, knowing that there's a closer chord that you can get to that just uses the top part of that. So instead of trying to make a C major 7, you might be in a place where you want to play an E minor, and you probably know a lot of E minors, and you could make that work for you. And then like on accordion, it's just absolutely necessary because of the way that accordion works. You have to know this stuff. You have to know how those chords work so that you can build bigger chords, because the only chords that are actually built into the buttons are majors, minors, dominant, and diminished. So if you want to build something like a half diminished, you need to know how to do that. If you want to build a major 7th chord, an actual major 7th, you need to push 2 different bass buttons to make that happen. But that means that you have to know how to build that chord. You really have to know how to build that chord. Same thing, 9th chords are even more complicated. So you really need to understand how parts of chords, chords are parts of other chords and that kind of thing. So on that note, if you play a wind instrument or really any monophonic instrument, you need to work on arpeggiating these things. And that includes being able to arpeggiate from the inversion, so that once again, you can think about a chord from any point and be able to play it. And ultimately, if you're playing through a progression on a wind instrument, you need to be able to turn around and get to any point in that chord and go in whatever direction. So if I had, like C, G, F, I need to be able on, if I'm playing my trumpet, I need to be able to do something on C like G is F. I need to be able to do that very quickly and be able to get around to those things. That's just something you need to be able to do so that you're very familiar with these chords, and that'll really help with improv, and it's just technically fantastic. So definitely work on that. Okay, so as a conclusion, I thought I'd throw out some ideas for how you can do some mental practice away from an instrument to improve your ability to work on chords. One thing you could do is you could do flashcards. I think there are flashcard apps you can pull up on your phone or something that would just let you randomly do this. Or you could literally take a deck of cards and do this and just assign a key to each whatever number of a card you draw, something like that. Whatever you need to do. Take a 12-sided die. That'd be great. But pick a key and then do something like, I want to be able to say the sixth of a key. So then I would just pick at random. Okay, E, the sixth of that is C sharp. G, the sixth of that is E. So you need to be able to very quickly think the scale degree, and then also obviously the chord that's associated with that. So you could make a game out of that. You could also do the reverse in that particular case, where you say, okay, I'm going to say that whatever I pick is the fifth. So what's the one chord in that key? Okay, D, so the one chord is G. That kind of thing. You can go both directions. You can also just think through a chord progression. Pick a chord progression like the easy ones we used earlier, 1, 6, 4, 5, and then just do that in every key. I'd recommend, if you can, set a steady tempo, and you can really find your weak keys by doing this. So you can either clap or snap or pat your lap and kind of set a steady tempo, and then say, okay, I'm going to do this in B flat. So you're like B flat, G minor, E flat, F, and then say I want to go to A flat, F minor, D flat, E flat. And so see how quickly you can think through a chord progression and not lose your tempo, and see how many keys you can go through and not lose tempo. Just a tempo that you set, and then try to just get faster. I mean, obviously the metronome lets you do that a little easier. But these are things that you can do away from your instrument that really let you work on these progressions. Or definitely a thing that if you're doing kind of the jazz stuff, doing the polychord or upper structure stuff, thinking through that very quickly, that's a very taxing process with many steps that you eventually need to smash down into one instant step. So just make work of this away from the instrument. It'll be great.